My mother-in-law stood in the middle of my kitchen in the house that my husband and I had chosen together, painted together, filled with furniture we'd argued over for 3 weekends straight, and she looked at me like I was something she'd tracked in on the bottom of her shoe. "You were never going to last," she said. "Women like you never do." I set down my coffee mug. Slowly. I didn't say a word. She mistook my silence for defeat. She always did. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told a single person yet, was that 48 hours earlier I had met with a lawyer in a glass tower on Bay Street, and everything my mother-in-law thought she owned was already, quietly, mine. I should tell you how I got there, because it didn't start with lawyers or inheritance or any of the things that word money conjures when you attach it to a family like theirs. It started the way most things start, with a Tuesday and a coffee, and a man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes. I was 31 when I met my husband. I was working as a registered nurse at a mid-sized hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. Not glamorous, not Toronto, not the kind of city people name-drop at dinner parties. I had a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side, a car with a heating system that worked about 60% of the time from October to March, and a student loan I was chipping away at like it was a granite countertop, and I had a plastic fork. I was not, in any measurable sense, the kind of woman his family expected him to bring home. His name was Elliot. He was a civil engineer who had grown up in Rosedale, Toronto's version of old money, the kind of neighborhood where the houses don't have for sale signs because they're passed between families like heirlooms. His grandmother had come from Quebec with nothing and built a construction empire from the ground up. By the time Elliot was born, the family had more money than any of them could realistically spend, and more opinions about how to spend it than was healthy for anyone involved. We met at a retirement party for a mutual friend. A situation so mundane I almost didn't go. I'd worked a double shift the day before. My hair was in a bun that had started the evening neat, and by 9 o'clock had become something more interpretive. He found me in the kitchen, looking for ginger ale because the only thing worse than being tired at a party is being tired at a party with a headache. And he said, "The ginger ale's behind the sparkling water. The host hides it. She thinks it's embarrassing." I said, "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 3 months." He laughed, genuinely, not politely, I noticed. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about a bridge project he was working on in Sudbury. I told him about a patient I'd had that week, an 84-year-old man named Mr. Tremblay, who had asked me every single morning if I'd eaten breakfast, even when he was the one in the hospital bed. Elliot listened like the story mattered. Some people are good at faking that. He wasn't faking. We went for dinner the following Saturday, then the Saturday after that. Then it stopped being Saturdays and started being whenever we could, which was not easy with my rotating shifts and his project timelines. But we made it work, because when something is worth the logistical headache, you figure it out. His family. I didn't meet them for almost 6 months. He wasn't hiding me, I understood that later. He was protecting something. He'd watched his mother dismantle 2 previous relationships by simply applying sustained, elegant pressure until the other person cracked. He wanted us to be solid before she got anywhere near us. His mother's name was Helena, and I want to be precise about Helena because it would be easy to describe her as a villain and leave it at that. But the truth is more complicated, and I think she deserves the complicated version even now. Helena was brilliant. She had managed the family's investment portfolio since Elliot's father passed, a man I only ever knew from photographs, who looked like someone who laughed easily and meant it. She had grown the family's assets by roughly 40% over 12 years. She served on the board of 2 hospital foundations. She raised money for causes she genuinely cared about. She had real friends who genuinely loved her. She was also the kind of woman who decided, within approximately 4 minutes of meeting me, that I was a problem to be managed. I remember the first dinner clearly. It was at their house in Forest Hill, a different house than the one in Rosedale, which they also still owned because of course, and the table was set for 12 people when there were 5 of us eating. The extra place settings were not a mistake, they were a statement. Helena asked me where I was from. I told her Hamilton. She asked where I'd gone to school. I told her McMaster. She asked what I did. I told her I was a nurse. There was a pause, barely half a second, the kind that most people wouldn't catch. And then she smiled and said, "How important." She meant the opposite. We both knew it. Over the next year, the comments arrived at regular intervals, always wrapped in something that could be mistaken for politeness if you weren't paying close attention. She mentioned once at Easter that Elliot had been close with a woman he'd dated years ago, from a good family, the Hendersons, you might know them, as if I might feel something about a family I'd never heard of from a city I'd lived in for 4 years. She brought up my student loan twice in conversations I still don't fully understand how she knew about it. She asked at Christmas dinner in front of 9 people whether I'd thought about going back to school. "For what?" I asked. "Something with more of a future," she said pleasantly. Elliot said, "Mom." Just that one word. She changed the subject without blinking. What Helena never understood, and I think this is the thing that eventually undid her, was that I didn't need her approval to feel secure. I had grown up in a household where money was discussed at the kitchen table, not as an aspiration but as a logistics problem. My mother had worked 2 jobs for 6 years to get me and my sister through university. I knew what things cost. I knew what they were worth. I did not walk into rooms waiting for someone to decide I belonged there. Helena found this unsettling in a way she couldn't name, so she named it something else instead. She decided I was calculating. Strategic. After we got engaged, she started using the word opportunistic. Not to my face, but I heard it second-hand from Elliot's cousin Lysa, who told me at the engagement party with the slightly guilty expression of someone who thinks you deserve to know. We got married in September. The wedding was in Muskoka, at a rented property on a lake, small and genuinely ours, 40 people. A caterer I found through a friend, wildflowers Elliot's aunt helped arrange the morning of. It was the best day of my life. Helena sat in the front row in a cream dress that was almost but not quite white and smiled for the photographs. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for almost 3 years, was that Elliot had met with his lawyer the month before our wedding. He hadn't told me. He would explain later, in a letter I didn't read until after he was gone, that he hadn't told me because he didn't want me to feel like he was preparing for something bad. He was just, as he put it, being an engineer about it. He had looked at the structure of his family's estate, the existing will that his mother had significant influence over, the history of how she operated, and he had decided to build a separate foundation before any of it could shift. He had opened a joint account that was mine alone to access if anything happened to him. He had put the house we bought in Oakville, which we'd purchased together, with a down payment that came half from his inheritance and half from my savings, in a trust that was entirely protected. He had written the letter to his lawyer with instructions so detailed that the lawyer told me later he'd never seen anything quite like it from someone who was 34 years old and, by every indication, perfectly healthy. The letter to me was last. He'd sealed it and put it in our filing cabinet behind the insurance documents, with a sticky note that said, "Open if I'm not around to explain." He was 37 when he died. A cycling accident on a trail outside Burlington, on a Saturday morning in April when the ice had mostly cleared and the light was that specific pale gold that only happens for about 3 weeks in early spring in Ontario. A truck making a turn. One of those things that happens in a fraction of a second and rearranges everything that comes after. I got the call at 11:14 in the morning. I was doing laundry. Helena arrived at my house at 4 in the afternoon the same day. I want you to understand the timeline there. Her son had been dead for less than 5 hours. She didn't come to grieve with me. I understood that within about 30 seconds. She came with Elliot's uncle, a man named Philip who had the affect of someone who had spent his entire career adjacent to lawyers without ever becoming one. And she sat down at my kitchen table with the particular posture of someone who has rehearsed the next few minutes. She said she knew this was a terrible time. She said she was devastated. She said that of course we all needed to process this together as a family. Then she said she'd been speaking with the estate lawyer, her estate lawyer, the one the family had used for 20 years, and she wanted to make sure I understood that Elliot's assets were, in the first instance, part of the family estate, and that she would be working closely with that lawyer to ensure everything was handled appropriately. I looked at her. I thought about the filing cabinet. I thought about the sticky note. "I'm sure it will all be handled appropriately," I said. She looked at me the way she always had, assessing, calculating, waiting for me to do something that confirmed whatever she'd already decided about me. She didn't find it. She left an hour later with Philip, who had not said a single word the entire time. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was very quiet in the way it only gets when the person who usually makes noise in it is permanently gone, I went to the filing cabinet. I found the letter. I sat on the floor of our home office and I read it twice. The first time I couldn't see properly because of the tears. The second time I read every word. Elliot wrote the way he talked. Direct, a little dry, occasionally funny in a way that made the funny parts harder to get through than the serious ones. He told me he loved me in the matter-of-fact way of someone who considers it a fact, not a sentiment. He explained what he'd done and why. He told me the name of his personal lawyer, a man named Richard O'Say, whose office was on Bay Street, and he said Richard had everything and I should call him first thing Monday morning and not sign anything or speak to anyone in his family before I did. He also wrote, "My mother is going to make this hard. I'm sorry about that in advance. You don't need her permission for anything, not for the house, not for the accounts, not for the estate. I made sure of that. She's going to tell you that you do. She's going to tell you that you do. She's going to be very convincing. She's wrong." Then he wrote, "You were the best decision I ever made. Please take care of yourself. Eat breakfast." That last line, that was Mr. Tremblay's thing. I had told Elliot that story on the night we met. He had remembered it for 6 years and put it in a letter he wrote, hoping I'd never have to read it. I sat on that floor for a long time. Monday morning I called Richard O'Say. He was expecting my call. He told me Elliot had been in to see him 4 months ago to update everything. This was after we'd had a conversation about Elliot's family that had gotten more honest than usual, a conversation I had mostly forgotten because we'd resolved it and moved on. Elliot had not forgotten. The house was in a trust registered in my name. The joint account, separate from anything his family had access to, held a sum that, when Richard told me the number, made me sit down in a chair I hadn't realized I was already standing next to. Elliot had also structured a portion of his inheritance, the portion that had passed directly to him from his late father, separate from anything Helena controlled, in a way that was now mine, cleanly, legally, with no mechanism by which Helena could challenge it without it being immediately apparent in court that she was trying to override the documented wishes of her own son. Richard also told me that Helena had already called his office. On Sunday, the day after Elliot died, I felt something then that I still don't have a clean word for. It wasn't anger. I'd been moving past anger since the conversation at my kitchen table on Saturday afternoon. It was something more like clarity, a kind of cold, still understanding of exactly who I was dealing with and exactly how little she could actually do. The funeral was the following Friday. It was everything Helena had not wanted our wedding to be: formal, large, a church in Forest Hill, 300 people. I understood why. Elliot had belonged to a community that needed to mark his death properly, and that community was partly hers, and I wasn't going to fight about it. I wore a black dress, and I shook hands and accepted condolences, and I cried exactly as much as I needed to, regardless of who was watching. Helena did not speak to me at the funeral reception, except once, briefly, to say that she hoped I understood that the family would be consulting with their lawyer about the estate, and that she assumed I would cooperate fully. Of course, I said. She waited for more. I didn't give her any more. The communication from her lawyer arrived 11 days after Elliot died. It was framed carefully, not as a challenge exactly, more as a clarification of the family's understanding of the estate structure, which happened to conflict with what Richard had already shown me in black and white documents with Elliot's signature on them. I forwarded it to Richard. He responded within 48 hours. I was copied. The response was concise in a way that I imagine surprised Helena's lawyer considerably. What followed was 2 months of back and forth that I will not describe in full because it was exhausting and painful, and ultimately entirely pointless. Pointless because Elliot had been thorough enough that there was simply nothing to challenge that wouldn't immediately collapse under the weight of what he'd documented. Helena's lawyer eventually advised her, I was told second-hand, that proceeding would cost more than it could possibly yield and would result in the kind of public record that a family like theirs preferred to avoid. She called me herself on a Wednesday evening in June. She did not apologize. That is not something Helena does. But she said, and I have thought about these exact words many times since, Elliot was always more like his father than I realized. I thought about his father in those photographs. The easy laugh. Yes, I said, he was. We have not spoken since. I stayed in the Oakville house for another year. I needed to be somewhere I'd been with him. I needed to wake up in the room we painted ourselves, a ridiculous shade of green that we'd argued about, and then both came to love, and to walk through spaces that still carried the shape of our life together before I could figure out what shape came next. Eventually, I figured it out. I took a leave from the hospital and then a new position, a specialty nursing role I'd wanted for years but hadn't pursued because the timing was never right. The timing was never going to be right. I pursued it anyway. I moved to a smaller place in the West End of Hamilton, close to my sister, close to my mother. I think about Elliot differently now than I did in the first year. In the first year, grief is mostly just grief. This enormous, unwieldy thing that doesn't organize itself neatly or respond well to logic. Now I think about him with something more like gratitude. Not just for what he left me, though that too. For what he understood about me when he made those decisions, that I didn't need to be rescued, but that being protected was different, and that protection, given quietly and in advance, was a form of love. Helena had looked at me and seen a woman without resources trying to attach herself to a man with them. What she had never been able to see, what Elliot had seen from the beginning, was that I had never needed what she was guarding. I just needed him. The last time I walked through that Oakville house before I handed over the keys, I stood for a minute in the kitchen doorway, the same spot where Helena had told me I'd never last, and I thought about that Tuesday at the party, and the ginger ale behind the sparkling water, and Mr. Ale, Tremblay asking every morning if I'd eaten breakfast, and the letter I'd read sitting on the floor in the dark. Then I picked up my keys, and I walked out into the late afternoon light, and I drove home. There's a line Elliot wrote near the end of his letter that I keep coming back to even now. He said he wasn't trying to rescue me. He just wanted to make sure that if something happened, the truth would still be there, documented, signed, impossible to argue around, so that I wouldn't have to fight for something that was already mine. That distinction matters to me. There's a difference between someone who saves you and someone who simply refuses to leave you unprotected. One assumes you're weak, the other knows you're not. Helena assumed I was weak. She built that entire picture of me, the small city nurse, the student loan, the girl from Hamilton who didn't know which fork to use at a Forest Hill dinner table. And she decided it meant I had no standing. Then, what she couldn't see because it didn't fit the picture, was that I'd spent my whole adult life building something real out of not very much. That's not weakness, that's the opposite of it. But I don't think Helena's failure was about intelligence. She was a genuinely smart woman. Her failure was simpler than that, and I've thought about it enough to say this plainly. She stopped being honest with herself a long time ago. She'd mistaken control for love so many times that she couldn't tell them apart anymore. She thought she was protecting her family. What she was actually doing was protecting her own idea of how things should be arranged. Those are not the same thing, and the difference eventually cost her the only thing that would have mattered, her son's trust. Elliot had integrity in the old-fashioned, quiet way. Not the kind you announce, the kind that shows up in what you actually do when it costs you something. He paid a price for marrying me, in friction, in dinners that went sideways, in a relationship with his mother that never quite healed. He paid it anyway, and then he went further. He sat down with a lawyer and thought carefully about every contingency and wrote it all out because he believed that doing right by the people you love is worth the work, even when they're not in the room to see you doing it. I think about the kind of person it takes to do that, the clear-headedness, the willingness to look at hard possibilities without flinching away from them. He was 34 years old, healthy, and planning for a future he had every reason to expect. And he still made the time to think, but what if? That's not morbid. That's wisdom, the kind that doesn't get taught anywhere, that you either develop or you don't. And then there's the part that belongs to me. I won't pretend the 2 months after Elliot died were anything but brutal. Helena's lawyer, the phone calls, the documents, all of it landing on top of grief that didn't care about timelines or legal strategy. There were days I didn't want to deal with any of it. There were days I almost didn't. I dealt with it anyway. Not because I'm exceptional, because I'd made a decision somewhere along the way, probably somewhere in those years of rotating shifts and loan payments and dinners at Helena's table where I was made to feel like a guest in my own life. That I was not going to let other people's version of me become the version I believed. That decision is the only thing that was entirely mine. Elliot protected what he could protect. The rest was up to me. It still is.